Welcome, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm John Coleman. I'm the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts, and it is an honor to be here to honor Bob Litterman today. I told Bob a moment ago we will do our best to embarrass him immensely over the course of the next 4 hours with lots of praise and words of appreciation. So we are here today indeed to hear from and to honor one of the College of Liberal Arts' most distinguished alumni, Dr. Robert Litterman, and to celebrate his receipt of the University of Minnesota Outstanding Achievement Award. Dr. Robert Litterman earned his PhD in economics here at the University of Minnesota in 1980, and he went on to join the economics faculty at MIT. He returned to Minnesota to work as a research economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, and then went back east to enjoy a successful 23-year career at Goldman Sachs. In 2010, Dr. Litterman became a founding partner of Kepos Capital, a New York-based, globally focused asset management firm where he currently serves as the chairman of the Risk Committee. Bob also dedicates his time and expertise to tackling pressing societal issues, including risk assessment, health, and climate change. Dr. Litterman generously shares his expertise by serving on a number of boards, including the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, the nation's largest private foundation devoted solely to health. Roger Fine, chair of the foundation's Board of Trustees, wrote that, quote, "Central to human health is the health of the environment, including the key issues related to global warming and climate change. Bob, of course, is a recognized international guru on this subject and provides invaluable insight, knowledge, and wisdom in this regard to our board and staff." Dr. Litterman is also currently serving as the chair of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission Climate-Related Market Risk Subcommittee and on the boards of the World Wildlife Fund, Common Fund, Resources for the Future, and the Sloan Foundation. Here at the U of M, he has served on the Heller-Hurwicz Economic Institute's advisory board since 2011, and most recently, he and his wife Mary served on the steering committee of the university's Driven campaign. Among many other honors, Bob was inducted into Risk Magazine's Risk Management Hall of Fame and was named the Risk Manager of the Year in 2013 by the Global Association of Risk Professionals. Today, we are delighted to add another honor to that list, the University of Minnesota's Outstanding Achievement Award. We're also honored this afternoon to be joined by Professor Christopher Phelan of the U's Department of Economics, who will guide this conversation with Dr. Litterman. Professor Phelan serves as an advisor at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. His research interests are in dynamic contracting, government reputation, game theory, and macroeconomics, making him exceptionally well-suited for this conversation. So please join me now in welcoming Dr. Bob Litterman and Professor Chris Phelan.
So I've known Bob a long time as a faculty member and my years as department chair. I'm not department chair anymore. I've been impressed not only with his expertise in risk management, but also his willingness to share his time with our graduate students and his genuine desire to use his expertise to address some of the grand challenges of our time. So this afternoon, we have a wonderful opportunity to have a conversation with Bob about his career path, his advice for those hoping to follow in his footsteps, and what he sees as the opportunities for economists to make a difference. So I'm going to start with some questions for Bob, and then we'll have an opportunity for you in the audience to ask questions as well. Afterward, we will be joined by President Gable and Regent McMillan for the official conferral of the Outstanding Achievement Award. So I try to keep my questions short, and this one I'm failing. This is going to be a long question. So Bob, you've had a remarkably unusual career path, which people in the room might not know about. First, you came here to Minnesota to study economics as a grad student. Then when you graduated, you got perhaps the best placement in the profession to become an assistant professor at MIT. Then, after not being there for that long, you made what I considered to be the incredibly gutsy move to move back to Minneapolis to be a researcher at a place that I'm very fond of, the Minneapolis Fed. And then, only 6 or so years after graduation, moved to Wall Street to continue to do research, but also put your research and ideas into practice. Can you tell us about that time? Because to me, while I'm looking at someone who has made truly pioneering contributions to the study of risk, these seem like they were incredibly risky moves. Can you tell us what drew you twice to the Minneapolis economics community and whatever you want to talk about that time?
Sure, Chris. Thank you for that question. I have had a rather strange career, I would say. You know, before I came here, I was a journalist, and I worked for the San Diego Union. They sent me out to El Centro, California. Now, that's not a great place if you're a young single male. And, you know, there's a lot of cows out there, but not a lot of eligible young women. And so I decided I would go back to school. And, you know, I ended up deciding to study economics at UC San Diego. And I happened to share an office with a young lady who's here tonight, my wife, Mary. And Mary is from Minneapolis. So, in fact, that's what drew me here the first time. After a year in San Diego, Mary decided to come back home. And in that August of that summer, I decided to follow her and just stop by the university. The head of graduate studies there was Neil Wallace, and I think he took pity on me. I showed up and said, any chance I can enroll here in a few weeks? And he said, well, sure, we don't have any money for you, but, you know, you're welcome to come. Minnesota at that time had kind of a Chicago school attitude, you know, sure, come on in. We flunk half the students, but, you know, we don't have any money, but come on in. So I thought that made a lot of sense. But he also said, you know, usually we have a student who works at the University Computer Center. This was, 1976 or something, and so computers were different in those days. This was a big mainframe off campus somewhere, and they had consultants. He said, do you know anything about computers? So I lied a little bit and said, oh, yeah, I'm pretty good. And so I got a job as a consultant sitting there answering questions from students, you know, like, can you help me with this assembler question? And I was like, okay, maybe. I've never learned that language, but anyway, it worked out pretty well. I was given the assignment of supporting 2 large econometric software packages. And, well, they were actually, it was a biomedical package and SPSS for those of you who know something about statistical analysis. And that turned out to be a pretty useful set of skills. I did end up going to MIT. And, well, you know, that was a very useful 2 years. There were a lot of smart people there. I met a lot of folks. I had an office next to Larry Summers and Paul Samuelson and, you know, a lot of very smart people. But coming from Minnesota, I was a little bit of a fish out of water, I must say. The economics at Minnesota was very different than the economics at MIT. And after a couple of years, we were there. Well, I worked very hard. I learned a lot of useful stuff. But I thought maybe I'd be better appreciated back in Minnesota. And indeed, I talked to my advisor, Tom Sargent, and said, you know, any chance I might be able to get a job back here? The next day, Art Rolnick called me up and said, Bob, would you like to work at the Fed? And the next day, I said, all right, I'm out of here. And came back and have never regretted it. Now, I must say, there were some folks there at MIT. Tim Keogh was here. His brother was there. A lot of really good people. And, you know, maybe our discussions about Minnesota versus MIT led some of them to come here. I don't know. But anyway, so that's how I got here twice.
Okay. Then you moved to Goldman Sachs. So when you joined Goldman Sachs, I imagine it was quite a change from working in academia. Thinking back on that time, what surprised you about the financial industry that perhaps we didn't prepare you for during your years as a PhD student?
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you the biggest surprise was how well prepared I was. You know, when I was at Minnesota and ready to leave and go on, and my advisor, again, Tom, said to me, Bob, where are you going to teach? Or where would you like to teach? And I said, oh, Tom, I'm not planning on teaching. I'm going to go into business. And he said, oh, Bob, no, you can't go into business. You're not prepared for business. The only thing you've been prepared for is to teach. And I was a little naive. I didn't realize saying I'm going into business would be a problem, but it is a problem. And he gave me some good advice. He said, Bob, you know, you can always go to business later if you go to academia, but this is you have to go in the job market now if you want to go into academia. So why don't you do that? Why don't you try and then see how it works out? And well, you know, I did do that, and it worked out. I went to Wall Street, and it turned out that the quantitative tools that I had picked up in the economics department at Minnesota served me very well. And in fact, the surprise to me was when I went to MIT as a faculty member, and you know, they had me teaching, for example, money and banking was one of the first classes I was given to teach. It was undergraduate money and banking. I'd never taken that course. So there, I was not really all that well prepared. And in fact, I took graduate level money and banking, but for those of you who have taken money and banking from Neil Wallace, he came in the first day and he said, all right, everything you learned in undergraduate money and banking, I want you to forget about it. We're going to teach overlapping generations models, and that's what we did. So there I got to MIT. I was totally unprepared to teach undergraduate money and banking. Whereas when I went to Wall Street, you know, the first day they said, we want you to fit this curve, and we want you to, you know, do this modeling and price this option. And these were all things that I was pretty prepared to do in terms of the skill set that I had learned at Minnesota. And there were so many interesting problems. At MIT, I was sitting around thinking about how can I do, what would be good research? What am I, and when I got to Wall Street, it was just 3 times a day, someone would say, what about this? What about that? Can you help me with this? And so I was really surprised how much value I could add on Wall Street. It was kind of a nice surprise, I must say.
That fits very well with my next question. So out of that time at Goldman, you and Fisher Black created and published the Black-Litterman model of asset portfolio allocation. So the Black-Litterman model was a big deal, not just in economics journals or finance journals, but also immediately put into practice. So I wrote here, my notes, the number of economists who have their name attached to a model is very small. There's this model, that model, but the Black-Litterman model is one of them, and also incredibly distinguished, the number of people who have a model named after them. So what would you like to tell us about that model or that time?
Okay, well, first of all, let's be clear. There's a lot of models named after Fisher Black. So you know, Black-Scholes, Black-Litterman-Toy, Black-Litterman. There's a pattern there that, you know. I would tell you that I was very lucky in my career. I was telling someone about it a few weeks ago, and they said, boy, that sounds a lot like Forrest Gump. You went to Minnesota, Tom Sargent, Chris Sims, Lars Hansen, Fisher Black. And yeah, so I was very lucky in that sense to, you know, my interaction with Fisher. Fisher was an interesting character. Of course, he passed away in 95, I think. But I first met him here at Minnesota. He came, I was working at the Federal Reserve Bank, and he was thinking about and studying rational expectations. And Minnesota was known as one of the centers of study of rational expectations. So he kind of said, can I come out to Minnesota and give a talk? And he came to actually the bank and gave a talk. And you know, being a research assistant there, I was invited to the talk, and it was one of the strangest seminars I'd ever been in. Now, later I learned Fisher's seminars are always a little strange, but he got up and started talking about a rational expectations model with trees and this and that. And I think it was my advisor, Tom, who asked him, maybe 5 minutes into the seminar, could you talk a little bit about the production technology? And Fisher thought about it. sat down, started writing some notes, and basically that was the end of the seminar. At that point, it just became a discussion. I thought, okay, this is an interesting character. The next time I saw him was at MIT, and he was a professor there. So we would interact, and it was kind of a similar thing. We were at a cocktail party one evening, and we were talking, and he pulled out a notebook, started taking notes, and So then later, which is kind of unusual behavior, I would say, at a cocktail party, but we crossed paths at Goldman. He interviewed me. He was head of equity research. I was being interviewed for a job in fixed income research. This was back in 1986, and quants were kind of a new thing on Wall Street. Goldman Sachs had hired Fisher and kind of was making a bet that these rocket scientists, so to speak, could add value. And so I was being interviewed, and Goldman, just to be clear, had called me up and said, "We really think you should come." So I was being recruited. And Fisher said, "So Bob, you're an econometrician." And I was very proud of that. I said, "Yes, I'm an econometrician." What I didn't know is that Fisher thought econometricians were worthless. So he said to me, "Really? So what makes you think econometricians can add some value on Wall Street?" And I was like, I didn't really know what an investment bank did. So here I'm being asked, how can I add value? I was like, well, maybe we can estimate some parameters or something. I don't know. Luckily, I was being interviewed for a job in a different department, and so I got the job. But later at Goldman, I was asked to build an asset allocation model. It was one of the, as I say, 3 times a day I would be asked to do something that would be interesting. I'd never used an asset allocation model. It was a mean variance, the simple versions were mean variance optimizers, and I figured, well, I can program that up. But before doing that, my boss said, why don't you talk to Fisher and see what he thinks? So I went, talked to Fisher, and he said, well, my theory is start simple, and if that works, done. If it doesn't work, then you can get to a more complicated approach. So I went back and programmed up the math for an asset allocation model. We were trying to do global allocations of bond portfolios. And so we had like 18 countries with interest rates and exchange rates. And they're highly correlated assets. And you put them in, and you put in forecasts of yields and exchange rates into the future. And you back into expected returns, and you optimize. And I did that, and it looked crazy. The answers made no sense at all. I put in Goldman Sachs economist forecasts for interest rates and exchange rates. And, it said things like the optimal portfolio is long 180% New Zealand bonds and short 75% Canadian bonds. And then you put zero, no shorting constraints, because no one's going to go out and short these markets. And then it says 0, 0, 0, 0, and you hold 2 assets, and you go, that doesn't make sense. So I thought, I must have a bug in the code. There must be somewhere where I've multiplied everything by 100 or something. I spent a few days trying to debug it and convinced myself that it was working right, but it was so sensitive to the inputs. You change a little input here or there, the whole thing would change. I went back to Fisher and I said, Fisher, this mean variance optimization, it doesn't work at all. It's much too sensitive to the inputs. And he says to me, well, yeah, that's well known. And I was, I said, well, what do we do about that? And he said, well, I've been working on this equilibrium model. He called it universal hedging. And the interesting thing was I had seen this paper come across my desk. He had written a paper, a working paper, it had come across my desk. And I looked at it and thought, well, it doesn't have anything to do with what I'm working on. I'll get to that later. So here he is saying, no, we ought to build this into this model. So I thought, well, it sounds very academic to me, but, Fisher Black, famous, I'll try it. First, I had to figure out what it meant. That wasn't entirely obvious. Build an equilibrium into it. But it turned out it was an incredibly good idea. And what it basically meant is that you take this abstract model of equilibrium, which says everyone should hold the market portfolio, Now, most people are familiar with that in a domestic context. This was a global context, and so the universal hedging addressed what is a significant complication because people value their assets in different currencies. So it made it more complicated, but it basically gave you a set of expected returns, an outlook, if you will, that would justify holding the market portfolio. And it turns out that's a very nice place to start. But what I then thought was, well, let's take, okay, that's one set of forecasts, and we have our economist forecasts over here. Let's take and we know this gives a useful kind of answer. We know this gives crazy answers. So let's see, take a combination. But what I found is as soon as you move, 1% away from this, you go off in a crazy direction. And it was because I wasn't taking correlations appropriately into account with these highly correlated assets. So when you do that, which turned out to be a little bit complicated, but I had done my dissertation on combining information from two different sources here at Minnesota, so I had the math tools to do this. So I put it together, took account of the correlations, and voila, it worked very well. And the nice thing about it was that if you have a nice starting point, the equilibrium, you don't have to have a view about every asset. You can use the correlation information and the starting point, and you can say, I think U.S. bonds are going to go up. And then the model tells you everything else you need to know. And then it gives you a portfolio that's very well behaved. It tilts in the direction that you say your views have. And because you have this equilibrium, you can talk about your views as being strongly held or less strongly held. You can have as many views as you want, or what's really powerful is not having to have a view on everything. And you could express views more flexibly. Instead of saying, well, I think U.S. interest rates are going to be here, you can say, well, I think the spread between Canadian and U.S. bonds is going to narrow, or something like that. You can have a view about any linear combination of assets at all. So for quants, that becomes very powerful. You can say, I think cheap assets are going to outperform expensive assets. And I have these 5 different measures of cheapness or expensiveness. And I can now put all of that into the model, and it comes out with an optimal portfolio. So it really seemed like a pretty good idea at the time. And now we were going to call it the Goldman Sachs asset allocation model, but there was a group that was in charge of business development at Goldman, and they said, no. Call this the Black Litterman model. So we were like, okay. Now, one other thing that happened, is that about a month after we published this paper with our approach, the legal department called up and said, have you thought about intellectual property issues with respect to this? And I was like, no, we haven't thought about that. And Fisher was like, no, we have no interest in it. We're academics. We're gonna, So it went out, so there was no issue about proprietariness, and it did become kind of the standard model. If you get a CFA, degree these days, you study Black Litterman. So yeah, it's kind of cool.
I agree. So for a while now, though, a lot of your energy, both in research and advocacy, have been devoted to the issue of climate change. So you were at Goldman for 23 years, but that was a few years ago?
Oh yeah, that was. I got interested in climate change about the time that I was retiring from Goldman, I was thinking I was retiring. It turned out I didn't really retire, but. I was in risk management, and like most people, I thought, sounds like this might be risky, this climate issue. My undergraduate major, by the way, was human biology, and I had an interest in, thinking about people as being, social animals, and so I said, I was. Asked to lunch by one of my partners. The head of operations, Larry Linden, was a big environmental person at that time. He was on a number of boards. He invited me to lunch. He said, Bob, do you have any interest in the environment? And I said, I could, I'm kind of interested in climate change. It seems like a problem. And And I said to Larry, it seems like a risk management problem, and we're not pricing the risk. It's kind of a fundamental problem. And Larry said to me, he said, Bob, that's a brilliant insight from an economist. He was being sarcastic, of course. I said, but the problem is no one really knows where the risk should be priced. And I thought, well, I can't, I'm an economist. I can read the literature. I can't really believe that. There's got to be some work on this. And so I started, reading the literature and getting interested in it. And the more I read, the more I thought, Larry was right. This is really not a great literature. The basic model at the time was by a guy, Bill Nordhaus, who I'd known. He was a macroeconomist, and I knew him, but he got interested in climate long before I did. But the models in those days weren't that great. The computers weren't that great. And what he had basically done is what economists would call discounting expected future damages. And, it's the expected damages at that time, 50 years into the future. And in the meantime, on Wall Street, we had developed what's basically today called asset pricing theory, or risk pricing. And you have to take into account, correlations of damages with marginal utility. I won't get into too much of the detail, but I thought, this isn't being done. They're not taking risk into account. And so I got kind of sucked into it and started actually doing academic work again. I teamed up with a couple of other economists, Gernot Wagner, who's an environmental economist, and Kent Daniel, who's a financial economist. And we worked on it together and built a model and published it actually just a few years ago in the Proceedings of the National Academies. So it was an interesting thing that sucked me into climate change. And then, being a risk management person and having that focus, I thought, well, I should raise this issue. And I started talking to people, writing about it, joining boards, and it just really sucked me in. Now, there was one incident that really got me very passionate about climate change, and I'd like to tell you that story, Sure. If you don't mind. It has to do with my wife, Mary, who was with me. We were driving into New York to see a play. This is about 7 years ago, and we nearly died in an auto accident. We were driving along, it was pouring rain, and all of a sudden Mary exclaimed, "Oh my God, Bob, watch out." I didn't use the tone of voice that she used, but let me tell you, when she said it, I was like, oh my God, our lives are in danger. And I focused, and what I saw was this truck on the other side of a divided freeway coming at us. So, we were going 70 miles an hour, and it was coming at us 70 miles an hour. And the first thing I noticed is it was kind of bouncing in a way I'd never seen before. Big truck, about a quarter of a mile down the road. And there were flames coming out of the passenger side wheel well. And what I didn't know, but Mary had already realized, is that the truck was not coming straight down the highway. It was actually coming at an angle headed right at a point in front of us. And, the next 5 seconds were just the longest 5 seconds in our lives. It's like, to me, a video that I've seen 100 times now, because that truck just kept, as we watched, well, first of all, I should say I slammed on the brakes and started moving to my right because I thought, worst case, there could be debris on our side of the highway. That was before I realized the whole truck could be on our side of the highway. But that's what indeed happened. Over the next 5 seconds, that truck continued to move, there was a barrier, a concrete barrier, thank goodness, about 2.5 feet high. But as this thing came at us, big 18-wheeler, it rode right up over that barrier, launched into the air, and landed right in front of us. What we didn't know was it had already hit an auto, killed the driver, and that's why it was now out of control, and basically a lit fuse on a gasoline tanker that had 5,000 gallons of gasoline. And so that cab launched, landed right in front of us. There was no way we could have stopped, but I was able to get over far enough. We went right by the front of that cab, debris all over the highway, flames now 300 feet in the air. We missed the front of the cab by probably a foot. We were probably going 15, 20 miles an hour. The heat was incredible. We were the only car to go by that accident, to get by it. Everyone else stopped. The freeway was blocked for 7 hours. And, well, to me, what happened is I realized where we were when Mary said, "Oh my God, watch out," is where we are as a society with respect to climate change. Science has told us, watch out, you know? You don't know what the worst case is. The worst case could be a lot worse than you expect. And so what do? You know, you have to react immediately. If Mary had not said, watch out, and I had not slammed on the brakes, we wouldn't be here today. We missed that by a fraction of a second. And you just never know how much time you have. There, you know, so it's one of the lessons of risk management that I always tell people. You know, if you have enough time, you can solve any problem. We don't know how much time we have. There could be a tipping point out there, and you know, every year that goes by, the maximum temperature that we're going to hit goes up. The amount of time that we're going to have that goes up, and so I became very passionate about risk management, about urgency, and about slamming on the brakes. That's what I tell people about climate change. We absolutely have to slam on the brakes. And what I mean by that is we have to price emissions. That's the only brake we have. As economists, we all understand that. If you want to change people's behavior, and we absolutely do, then you have to change the incentives. That's what incentives are, things that change behavior. And in a modern economy, that's prices and wages. And you know, we haven't done it yet. I think we're getting very close, and we have to do it globally. But and I'm working on it, you know, every day. And I'm on a lot of boards. We're trying to get it done, but so far, no success.
So last year, you chaired the Commodity Future Trading Commission's Climate Risk Subcommittee. I hope I'm getting this right.
Yep.
Which delivered a report on managing climate risk in the U.S. financial system. Can you just tell us about that report and how it came about?
Well, yeah, and I think it's one of the most important things I've done in my career, maybe the most important. I was asked to do it by Commissioner Russ Benham, who was at the time one of two Democratic commissioners on the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. First thing you might ask is why, the CFTC, which is the regulator for derivatives markets, why were they taking the lead on climate? And the answer is because, the Fed hadn't done it, the SEC hadn't done it. This is back under the previous administration. And the Financial Stability Oversight Council, which really had the responsibility, hadn't done anything. And so this commissioner on the CFTC, who was the sponsor of what's called the Market Risk Advisory Committee of the CFTC, and being the regulator of derivatives, it really has a very strong risk management background and ethic to it. And so he got support from the other commissioners, surprisingly perhaps, 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats, to have this subcommittee. And so he had some hearings. He then asked for volunteers and talked to a bunch of folks about who might be interested in being on this subcommittee. He said to me, usually they get about half a dozen people who volunteer when they ask for something like that. In this case, they got 70 volunteers. And he did a really good job of establishing the subcommittee, finding good people. And he came to me and he said, Bob, I'd like you to chair this. Would you be interested in doing that? And, it was quite an honor to be asked to do that. I was very honest with him. I said, Russ, I'm all about pricing carbon. It's not about financial regulation. He said, that's okay. He said, I understand. If you're chairman, you can do it, you can address this and you can address it broadly. And he gave us an assignment. He said, I'd like you to write a high-level report, maybe 50 pages or so. I'd like you to put together as many high-level recommendations as you can with supporting arguments. And I'd like it to be unanimous. If you can get unanimity, that would be good. Now, it turns out I didn't, I'd never done anything like this, so I didn't know. But unanimous is a high bar, right? You have 35 members of a committee, and you got to get every one of them. Each one has a black ball. They can say no. And it wasn't just the members the members of the subcommittee were a very good and diverse group. So we had banks represented and insurance companies, of course, asset managers, asset owners. We had academics. We had environmental NGOs. An exchange was there. A data company was there. And so it was a very good, broad cross-section. But what the commissioner wanted is not just those individuals to approve the report, but actually to have the organizations and their general counsels. Now that is a really high bar. And but we had a couple of good meetings before COVID, and actually at the first meeting where we all sat around the table, I said I had no idea what to expect. I said, I think it's important that we price carbon, have appropriate incentives to reduce emissions. Anyone disagree with that? And, there was a representative from Conoco, one from BP. There were oil companies there. No, they were fine with that. And then we had a discussion about disclosure. That's another issue, climate-related disclosure. And we had a representative there who said, I think it should be mandatory, climate-related disclosure. I thought, okay, interesting. Anyone disagree with that? No one disagreed. So we were like, okay, well, let's see how far we get. And we divided the committee up into work streams and wrote this report. And we basically accomplished everything that Commissioner Benham wanted, except it wasn't 50 pages. It was about 180 pages. And there were 53 high-level recommendations, including number one, which was, we said, the most urgent and important, which is we have to put a price on carbon. And when we wrote a draft, we got back over 1,000 suggestions from the different organizations represented. We had some really good editors, really good people on that. We addressed some really hard issues, and we got compromise. I mean, there were a lot of things that had to be hammered out, but we did. And then we sent the draft back, the bank said, all right, you got to start over. We were like, no, we're not going to start over. And so we eventually got the banks on board. And we got unanimity. We published the report. And now, under the new administration, basically all of our recommendations are being going forward, including that the Financial Stability Oversight Council, which really has the primary responsibility for emerging risks to the financial system, and is chaired by Secretary Yellen. They've written a report themselves. They've had several meetings, and all of the major regulators, the Fed, the SEC, the CFTC, are represented there. They're all moving forward. I must say, I'm very pleased with what's going on, and I think we had an impact. We basically said, look, we all agree. You've got to price emissions. And then there's all these other things that we've got to do. And it's true, we do. And unfortunately, we haven't yet priced emissions. I'm sure we will, and I hope so soon. But it is really urgent. And not just in the U.S., of course, but around the world. But a lot of people don't understand the U.S. is actually blocking action primarily right now. The problem is the U.S. President Biden made a nice speech a couple of weeks ago, but and he directed it to other countries. He said we all got to move forward. I was like, maybe he should be talking here domestically.
Okay, thank you. So now for some truth in advertising. This event was advertised with the title, A Look at the Past and Into the Future of Minnesota Economics and Its Influence, at least to some emails. So what is it about Minnesota economics that you feel is distinctive or special from other places? How did it shape you as a research leader, climate advocate? What would you like our audience to know about Minnesota economics and its future prospects?
Well, truth in advertising, I'm probably not the right person to ask that question. I can talk about Minnesota economics when I was here, and I don't know that it's changed all that much, but it was incredibly rigorous. It was very focused on understanding what you're saying mathematically, making sure that it's clear, and then bringing data to apply to the models that you have and learning from that data. And those tools and those techniques and the rigor were just incredibly valuable. I came here as just undifferentiated interest in economics, and it really did a good job of getting me to think carefully and hard about difficult issues. At the time, I was focused on forecasting, which was Minnesota had a completely different approach than most other places at the time, led by Chris Sims, of course, and Tom Sargent, and there were just so many smart people too, and interesting. And there's one story that I would like to tell, though, and there was a professor here, Herb Moehring, who was a transportation economist. He passed away a few years ago, but really a smart guy. And when I was taking my microeconomics prelim, there was an essay question that was 30 points on the prelim, and it was a simple question. It said, defend smoothing of oil prices or reducing volatility of oil prices. And this is back when oil prices were bouncing around. We had the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. And I thought to myself, oh, I know how to do that, So I wrote down a model, and I had shocks to oil prices, and then I had a Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and you could adjust the amount that you're putting in or taking out, and so on. And I thought, oh, that was so up my, I just know how to do that. And it should have hit me that this was a micro prelim, not a macro. And I was using a lot of macro tools here to answer this question. So of course I get back to prelim, and it's, I flunk because I have 0 credit on this 30 points. Okay, and I thought I was going to get, I had a perfect answer. So I went in, I see Professor Moehring, and I say, how could you give me 0 on this? What were you looking for? He says, well, Bob, all you had to say is there is no defense. Full credit. I was like, what? He said, Bob, you put squared changes in oil prices into your utility function. You can't put prices in a utility function. What were you thinking? I was like, oh. So it left a little scar tissue, because now I had to take the prelim over again and study for weeks. And oh, man. So, years later, when I started thinking about climate change, and, you think about the current price for emissions is down there, and the appropriate price is up there, and you ask, how should that price path move? And the answer is, it should jump to the appropriate price. There's no excuse for smoothing prices, right? And so when I say it's time to slam on the brakes, that's where that comes from. And people have asked me sometimes, Bob, there's thousands of risk managers out there. You're the only one I know who's focused on climate. Why is that? And I think the answer is because there's a little scar tissue up there that says you don't smooth prices.
That's excellent. What advice do you have for our current students, both undergrad? This is the last question I'm asking. So we'll shift to audience Q&A shortly. So what advice do you give to current students, undergrads and grads, for following your footsteps? Or put another way, what do you wish you could have told your younger self?
Yeah. Well, what I tell young people whenever they ask me this is, when you're getting your first job, don't worry about the salary. Don't worry about the title. Worry about getting a job where you can build your human capital. That's really so important. And I don't know, that's how it worked out for me. I went to MIT, I met all these people, my network of people that has been useful to me ever since. And gosh, when I went to MIT, I think the salary there was $13,500. And I know there's been a lot of inflation, but that was, Mary got a job at $21,000 at the same time, so,
The 500 mattered.
I've had dinner bills that are more than that now. But anyway, yeah. So, I would say, building your human capital is really what young people should be thinking about.
Okay. So I guess it's my turn now to invite our audience members to pose questions to Bob. In the room here, we will have staff with microphones. Please wait until you have the microphone in your hand to ask your question so that our viewers online can hear you. For those of you on Zoom, please use the Q&A feature to type your questions, and one of our staff members will read them out loud. Any questions?
Bob, great job, and I'm glad to be here. I want to, it's very obvious and clear, these pricing carbon, but I was recently reading quite a bit about what's happening in South America, where basically the Uruguayans, Argentinians are having problems because the river is drying up in the south, and they think it's in part because the Amazon, people are turning the Amazon. So the challenge with that is that the folks who are by Brazil and the Amazon say, hey, we have these forests here. Why wouldn't we want to earn a living and cut it and do soybeans or eucalyptus or whatever? And then it's not very clear how the impact, but it's real, right? It's happening. So that's kind of the challenge with pricing, is that a lot of people all across the world, in many respects, in the developed countries like in Minnesota, there used to be a lot of forest. Now we have corn. So could you elaborate on that and explain how that really can play out? Because I don't understand how that can play out in the context of pricing carbon.
Yeah, I mean, so for instance, the nice thing about economics is it makes a lot of these, what seem like very complex problems, much clearer. So if we price emissions at some level, let's say $100 a ton, which is probably not high enough, it should be more than that. So you're saying to people, if you want to pollute, if you want to put a ton of CO2 into the atmosphere, I'm going to charge you $100. Well, if you're going to charge $100, then if someone can pull CO2 out of the atmosphere for $30, you'd certainly say, I'll pay for that, right? You'd want to do that. Well, there are a lot of cheap ways of pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere, like planting trees or not, cutting down trees, and so we should be. These are called natural climate solutions, and we should be doing a lot of them. Now, there's not enough out there to solve the problem. If we did every natural climate solution out there, we'd still have a lot more to do. The scale of this problem is hard to imagine. You think about every internal combustion engine creating pollution, we're going to have to run that in effect in reverse. But the natural solutions, like planting trees, are probably the cheapest. Now, you have to worry about things like other issues, like you don't want to plant eucalyptus forests instead of regular the natural forest, because eucalyptus suck more CO2 out. You want to protect other ecosystem services. And, if there's indigenous people there, you want to protect their rights as well and their livelihoods. So, but at the end of the day, we should be doing a lot of these forest carbon projects because they are the cheapest way to reduce CO2 emissions. And if we price carbon, that is essentially how you create the incentives that you need to address all these issues. So, I would say we have to do it. When we do it, we will start moving in the right direction. Right now, we have no incentive to reduce emissions, so people want to do it, but you can't do it yourself. It's all part of the economy. So we have to create these incentives and then let the economy decide what's the cheapest way to reduce emissions and where do I stop creating emissions and what can I do. Well, the nice thing about pricing it is you don't even have to worry. It's like it's all built in. And so I don't have to have a second set of accounts worrying about what shall I spend my money on and how shall I spend my carbon budget. It's just all built in. But if you don't price it, then we don't have the right incentives. And we can't make these decisions. And we'd have to have a complete separate carbon ledger. And a lot of people think that that's the right way to go. There's just not enough information processing to do that. You just build it into the price and go about your business. But if you don't build it into the price, then people are trying to come up with all these other ways to address it, like through regulations. And I'm not saying that regulations aren't right, but particularly when you think about the financial sector, it's the hope of making profits that cause people to make investments. And if we don't give them the right incentives, they move in the wrong direction. And so right now, you have economic agents all over the world who don't have the right incentives and therefore move in the wrong direction. If we give them those right incentives, we'll all be making the right decisions. And the only thing I would say that's important to recognize in addition to that is that it's not just the current price, but it's also expected future prices. And so today, when asset owners or asset managers are looking for investments, they're thinking about what are the incentives likely to be over the course of this, might be a 40-year project, and they're going to want to make investments that they think will be profitable given the expected future incentives. And I think asset owners, especially who are looking long distance into the future, are now realizing that we are going to price emissions globally, and so investments are shifting now. And you see it in markets. So, for instance, we were talking this morning about Tesla. I don't know if everyone understands, but when you think about the auto industry in this country, you're talking about Tesla. Its valuation today is over $1 trillion. When Mary and I bought our first Tesla, it was $200 billion. That was 7 years ago, I think. And I thought it was crazy then. Well, now it's, $1.2 billion. And Ford is like $70 billion. GM is... There was an article I read this morning. It said Tesla alone is worth the sum of the next 9 largest auto companies in the world. So markets are forward-looking, and there's an awful lot of movement of capital now. So that makes me a little bit optimistic.
Dr. Litterman, thank you, and congratulations on your honor. Well deserved. I'm fascinated about these economic models. As a meteorologist, we deal with models all the time. That old saying that, some models are, how does this go? I should have rehearsed this before I asked the question in my mind. All models are wrong.
Yes.
Some are useful. And it seems from the standpoint of meteorology that the weather models, which were derived mostly in the 20th century, can't keep up with a 21st century atmosphere, that the extremes that we're seeing many times are not predicted accurately by the weather models that we use. And the reason I bring this up is my father, who's 91, it took him many years for me to convince him that climate change was real, that it was happening. He now acknowledges that, yes, something is going on. His entreaty to me was interesting, at least I thought it was interesting. He said, we need a Pearl Harbor moment. There hasn't been a Pearl Harbor moment where people recoil and say, oh my God, now we're all in. What, based on your experience in the financial markets and elsewhere, what could that Pearl Harbor moment look like in financial circles? Is it going to be, the mortgage market? Is it going to be South Florida? What keeps you up at night? And with all of the studies into risk and risk management, where do you think we are most vulnerable in the markets today?
Well, I often get that question, and a lot of people are very concerned about the idea that people will wake up and all of a sudden realize, oh my God, this is real, and it's going to affect valuations. I don't think so. I mean, we just talked about Tesla, People think, fossil fuel assets are going to collapse in value, and that's going to create a financial crisis. They've already collapsed. If people haven't noticed, 10 years ago, I was chairing the investment committee at the World Wildlife Fund, and we asked, the directors were like, what are we going to do? Are we going to divest? How do we adjust our portfolio? And we did adjust our portfolio, but we also added something we called a stranded asset total return swap, which was a hedge about the embedded stranded asset risk in our portfolio. That swap was the best performing asset that we had for the next 10 years. The market outperformed those stranded assets by 18% per year. Well, we had it on 7 years. 7 years in a row of an 18% underperformance on average is an absolute collapse in valuation. And, and we made a lot of money from that swap. But those fossil assets have collapsed in value. Now, actually, in the last year, they've come back a little bit, nowhere near where they were. But that's already been priced in. If I were at the Fed worrying about financial risk, I think I'd be worrying more about Tesla right now, that's valued over $1 trillion, than about the collapse of Peabody Coal, the largest coal company in the country, which is $1.5 billion. And last week, Tesla went up like $170 billion, which is more than Ford and GM put together last week. I mean, it's just there's a lot of risk out there, and financial regulators should be worried about it. But I'm not so worried about transition risk. The real risk that we have is the risk that the temperature is going to be 3 degrees C warmer in 2100 or something like that. I don't really think it's going to be that, because I think we are going to slam on the brakes, and I think we're going to do better than that. I hope we do. But that's the risk I worry about. It's not something that I think is going to happen in the next 5 years or 10 years that's going to hurt the financial system. It's the risk of not acting in time. And so, again, we don't know how much time we have, and we certainly don't know what the worst case outcome might be. What I would say is, hope for the best, but that's not a risk management strategy. You got to be prepared for the worst case. And we just, we're doing this experiment on a very complex, planet for the first time. And we've got 7 billion humans on here that we've never had before. So there's a lot of risk, and we've got to make sure that we take care of it. Now, we had a day last year in California where the sun never came up. It was smoke from wildfires. It was pitch black all day. If that doesn't scare you, I don't know what is. Now, climate is very local. People, and frankly, the impacts are much worse in developing countries where they don't have the same infrastructure and ability to adapt to it. So there's a lot of uncertainty what's going to happen in terms of impacts on immigration, in terms of disease, in terms of the physical impacts, sea level rise. That's the sea level has risen just about 2 inches in the last 2 decades, but it's rising faster now than it was 20 years ago, and it's only going to keep rising faster and faster. So this is a problem that isn't going to go away, and I don't know how we speed up the response. I think we're getting close, but we should have responded 20 years ago or 30 years ago, and we can't wait 10 more years.
Go ahead.
So I think many of us agree on the idea of pricing carbon. The key question, though, is what price should we set? Should we set a price? Should we set a quantity? How do we figure that part out?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of ways to create incentives. Probably the simplest way would be a carbon tax. And where to set it is something, that's actually what I focused a lot on. Social cost of carbon, it's called. What should it be? Our model was very complicated, as I talked about, asset pricing theory and so on. But a simple way to think about it is every ton of carbon that we put into the atmosphere today will probably have to be sucked out of the atmosphere at some point in the future. And we're going to quickly get up to the cost of direct air capture. We can do some of these other things like planting trees and so on, but eventually we're going to have to do direct air capture. And so that's really the margin that people should think about. I can put a ton into the atmosphere or not today, and if I put it in, I should pay the amount that it's going to cost to pull it out of the atmosphere at some point in the future. Not necessarily, 10 years from now, maybe 20 years from now. So it's kind of the discounted present value of the expected cost of pulling that CO2 out of the atmosphere. And we don't know how expensive that's going to be. No one has done it at scale yet, direct air capture. There's a plant being built in Texas now where they hope to be able to do it for $250 a ton. But that's a hope. It hasn't been demonstrated yet. A lot of people think it'll be more expensive. So the way I think about it is that the expected discounted value of that is probably well over $150 today. And the problem is we don't know, so there's a lot of uncertainty. So you could think about a probability distribution of that parameter. And, when you don't trust your model and you don't have a good model, I think you have to act, with caution. And so be at the high end of that distribution. So I tell people I think it should be well over $100. And I'm glad to see now that a lot of other economists are saying the same thing. The U.S. government used to say $50 at the last time they did a serious study of this. I think they're going to release a new study, I think in January, and I expect the number to be much higher. And I think that's appropriate. So, but one other thing to say about models is, and some of the folks from Minnesota have done the good work on this, is that we don't trust models. Every model is, as Paul said, an approximation to reality. And so sometimes economists make the distinction between risk and uncertainty. And, the social cost of carbon is in that sense kind of a risk parameter. It's something that we base on a model. But when you don't trust your models, you have to err on the side of being cautious. And I think it's really the uncertainty of climate that we have to manage, not a parameter that we trust.
Okay.
Bob, wonderful conversation, wonderful career. What do we do with solar, hydro, and wind, which really are kind of the three primary alternatives that are so inconsistent and have not been able to consistently generate alternative power?
Well, we need a base load. And, if we create the appropriate incentives, then I'm sure some business will figure out what's the best base load. I happen to think it's probably nuclear and, next generation nuclear. But, who knows? And the reason we want to put a price on carbon is because when you create those incentives, you have all kinds of investors and entrepreneurs and businesses trying to solve that problem the cheapest way possible. If you wait for the government to subsidize, okay, I'm going to subsidize nuclear, well, maybe that's the right answer or maybe it's not. And, when you think about who's paying for it, people like to use subsidies because they think, oh, the government's paying for it. Well, that's you and me, taxpayers are paying for it. And it's not particularly efficient when the government is picking the winners and the losers. So I say just, make polluters pay. Everyone then has the incentive to reduce their emissions and, technology will be developed. And I don't know which technology. But yes, one of the things we need to worry about is the intermittency of solar and wind and hydro. And so we need a base load, and it could be nuclear or it could be something else. A lot of people are betting on hydrogen. And I'm very optimistic that when we create those incentives, everyone's going to have the incentive to solve the problem, and they'll work on it, and we will solve it. But I'm not too worried about the technology, and that.
We had a question from the Zoom. Would you be in favor of limiting the amount of lending that U.S.-based banks can provide to big oil, or even prohibiting it in the relatively near future? Given that fossil fuels need to disappear soon, what might be the downside to that policy?
Yeah, no, I'm not a big fan of regulating financial institutions and telling them what they can invest in or not invest in. And it goes beyond that. It's not just banks, but it's, corporations as well. People think that somehow if we force disclosure of emissions, that's going to solve the problem. it's not going to solve the problem. It will create some additional data, and we may know where the emissions are coming from. But what solves the problem is creating incentives to reduce emissions, not disclosure or putting constraints on banks of who they can lend to. And why do I say that? Because, if you say to banks, you can't lend to oil companies, well, I've got a friend down the street who says, oh, well, I can lend to oil companies, You create a margin where you say, people think, well, we're going to make it too expensive for oil companies to borrow. No, you're not going to make it too expensive, because as soon as you create that margin, there's someone else who's going to say, I'm going to come in and take advantage of that. So you can't create that. Now, I know in Europe, they're working on what they call a taxonomy, and they define what are green activities and not green activities, and they're hoping to use that kind of approach to make it more expensive to invest in fossil fuels. But they also have strong incentives already. In Europe, they are pricing emissions at over $100 a ton in most countries in Europe. And so guess what? They're already much more efficient in their generation of emissions. They're much less carbon intensive. They're decarbonizing much faster than we are. And so, yeah, they're working on these financial regulations. But I would say, start with a price on carbon. And then I would say, yes, we should have disclosures, appropriate disclosures. And, boards, asset owners that own corporations have governance responsibilities. And, those responsibilities are that businesses should be on a path toward net zero. There is going to be a rapid transition. They should be planning on it. And if their business plan is not consistent with that, asset owners have a responsibility to, provide oversight of management. So I agree with all that, but it's not going to create the incentives to reduce emissions. You got to have that price incentive first.
I think we've come to our last question.
Suppose that we go through with carbon prices and there is a carbon tax. And suppose that you are responsible for implementing it. So can you tell us more of what you would see in terms of, A, what kind of plan you would like to see in place and its implementability? Who should be taxed on emissions? How should emissions be measured? Can you tell us a little more about how we go from the concept to an actual proposal?
Yeah, well, I'm happy to do that. I'm the co-chair, along with Catherine Murdoch, of the Climate Leadership Council, and we are the sponsors of something called the Baker-Schultz Carbon Dividend Plan. And that is a bipartisan approach. Jim Baker and George Shultz are, well, George has now passed, but we're elder statesmen of the Republican Party. And so we have been trying to generate support for that approach. And by the way, we have a group of founding partners that includes a wide spectrum of U.S. corporations and environmental groups, and we've come up with a very detailed plan. So you can, go to the Climate Leadership Council and see. But basically, it involves creating a price on coal, oil, and natural gas, proportional to the carbon content of those fuels at the source, which then gets passed on throughout the economic system. So it's really not hard to implement. And it also, so that, by the way, creates a lot of revenue when you have a tax. So our plan distributes that revenue as a dividend on a per capita basis. So basically what we found is that 70% of Americans are better off after this because they're getting more from the dividend than they're paying in higher fuel costs. And that, of course, is the 70% of the less wealthy people because they use less energy. And so it's a very progressive plan. We also include in there a border carbon adjustment, which is a mechanism to prevent unfair, importing of carbon-intensive goods, and it also provides an opportunity for exporters to get a rebate on their plans. And so this is a plan that's well documented, well supported, and so you can look up the details. But the details aren't so important. There is a plan now as part of the reconciliation process. It's what's sometimes called a pay-for, but it's actually a carbon tax. And most people don't think it's going to be part of the package because they expect Senator Manchin to oppose it. I actually am more optimistic, although as time goes by, I think it becomes less and less likely. But it's a different plan. It's a very clever plan, though, because it starts at a very low price, $15 a ton, rather than ours, which starts at like $40 a ton. And but it goes up more rapidly. It excludes gasoline, which politically is very useful. And it turns out does not really hurt too much in terms of emissions because people who own internal combustion engine cars are actually not very likely to reduce their emissions very much. It's not very elastic, the demand for gasoline. So what we have to do is basically transform the auto fleet over the next 10 years to be primarily electric and then clean up the electric power generation system. And this plan in the reconciliation creates a carbon tax of $100 a ton by 2035 and would probably get us to the 50% reduction in emissions that we've promised the world that we would do by 2030. So if that gets in, that's fine. That's a completely different plan. The plan of the Climate Leadership Council is something that I'm supporting, but really the details of pricing are not that important. We just have to get it in there and create the expectations that those incentives are going to be rising and globally harmonized, which is very important. I think once the U.S. does create a price, Europe is way ahead of us. China, I think, is ready to move. And if Europe, U.S., and China create border carbon adjustments and prices on carbon, I think the rest of the world will quickly join in, and we'll get there. So I'm optimistic, but right now it's hard to be optimistic given what's going on in the U.S.
Well, thank you, Bob. It's been a pleasure to talk with you today.
My pleasure.
And so I'm glad so many could join us here and online. Now I'll turn the floor over to my boss's 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 boss, President Joan Gable, for the official conferral of the Outstanding Achievement Award. I think we need to go down here. Watch your step.
Hello, everybody. I tried a new mask today, and it has confounded my entire day. It's amazing how, on such a lovely occasion, such a small detail can create such a distraction. So thank you, everyone, for being here, and thank you, everyone watching online. It's a wonderful celebration of one of our truly remarkable alums, Dr. Robert Litterman. So I know you enjoyed the Q&A and gives you some insight into the nature of this award and why we have such an amazing recipient for it. The Outstanding Achievement Award is the highest honor that the University of Minnesota bestows on a graduate. This award may only be conferred on those graduates who've attained the unusual distinction in their chosen field or profession or in public service and who demonstrated outstanding achievement and leadership on a community, state, national, or international level. And of course, Bob has done all of that. So I was especially struck by the wonderful praise in the letters of nomination for Bob, acknowledging the unequaled impact he's had on the field of finance, as well as on some of our most challenging societal problems. So Professor Christopher Phelan illustrated just how groundbreaking it was when Bob co-founded the famous Black Litterman Global Asset Allocation Model, a key tool in investment management. And he wrote, "It is difficult to fully convey the lasting impact of the Black Litterman model on the investment world. It was innovative when it was developed nearly 30 years ago, and it is still widely used today, which cannot be said of many other global asset allocation models." Bob's truly an innovative economist who sees beyond traditional disciplinary boundaries. As Professor Phelan wrote, it is quite remarkable that Bob straddled both academia and Wall Street, and he's made lasting change in both. So in addition to the 23 years he spent contributing his expertise and leadership at Goldman Sachs, he's also established himself as one of the most important voices on the perils of a warming climate, as you've heard. Bob serves on several boards dedicated to environmental issues, including 13 years on the the board of directors of the World Wildlife Fund, whose president and CEO, Carter Roberts, wrote, "Bob's involvement in WWF's strategy has helped us become a leader in aviation climate policy and in other carbon pricing policy circles. His approach is cerebral, holistic," I love that word, by the way, "and wildly innovative. He pushes us to work outside our comfort zone and imagine solutions to the world's problems that will make a difference on a scale that matters." Here at the University of Minnesota, Bob's expertise and leadership as a Heller-Hurwicz Economics Institute Advisory Board member has been instrumental to the Institute's success. Regents Professor Stephen Pulaski wrote that Bob goes way beyond the usual role of advisor, actively working on issues with members of the organizations he is advising and often spearheading new ideas and new approaches. The generous sharing of expertise is a part of Bob's legacy and central to what we hope to honor with this award. So the full reach of Bob's impact is impossible to measure, but Dean Coleman put it well in his nomination letter when he wrote, "To have achieved the pinnacle of success in both academic work and the application of that work to the world we live in and will pass on to our children is an achievement that eloquently reflects the true potential of education." Dr. Brenda Davis from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation summed it up this way: "Bob's training as an economist at the University of Minnesota, his innovative Wall Street experience, and now his dedication as a nonprofit leader in addressing the world's most current challenges of our most urgent challenges of our generation surely have earned him this recognition for the university's Outstanding Achievement Award." It certainly has. And Bob, we are so proud of your many, many accomplishments. We're very honored to claim you as one of our own. Your outstanding career and advocacy reflect the excellence of our Department of Economics, and the number of times inspiring appeared in these letters of nomination was it was inspiring. So you're exceedingly deserving, and it's an absolute honor to present it to you tonight. So now I'd like to invite Regent McMillan to join me and Bob up here at the podium for the official conferral.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for the introduction, President Gable, and thank you, Dean Coleman, for the invitation to be part of this presentation of an Outstanding Achievement Award this evening to Bob Litterman. As a member of the Board of Regents, we get to do a lot of fun things, a lot of privileges, but one of the best privileges we have is to present Outstanding Achievement Awards to alumni and former students who have achieved unusual, as President Gable mentioned, but I want to say it again, who have achieved unusual distinction in their chosen fields, profession, or in public service, and importantly, who have demonstrated outstanding leadership on a community, state, national, or international level. The Outstanding Achievement Award is the university's highest honor presented to alumni, and Bob Litterman is a truly deserving recipient of this recognition. So, I have the citation here. I'm going to hand that to you, and rather than try to read from that, I'm going to read the citation from a little bit bigger print for these aging eyes. The citation reads, "Distinguished graduate of the University of Minnesota, leading research economist and author of groundbreaking work in asset allocation, risk management, and sustainable environmental policy related to climate change, co-developer of the Black-Litterman Global Asset Allocations Model, making advances in modern portfolio theory widely accessible to investors, passionate advocate for the environment, health equity, and sound economic policies, who has dedicated his time, leadership, and expertise to leading nonprofit organizations around the globe. The Regents of the University of Minnesota, as an expression of high esteem and in recognition of noted professional attainment, confer upon Robert Litterman this Outstanding Achievement Award on November 1st, 2021. Congratulations, Bob.
Thank you so much.
Now it's your opportunity.
Wow, I don't know what to say. I don't have anything with big print here, but thank you so much. I mean, this is totally unexpected. I don't know what got into you all thinking. But but it's really quite an honor, and I've never had something like this, so it's really unique and really touching to be honored this way, and to have so many people who I knew over the years come out and offer congratulations. I just really appreciate this, and hopefully we'll get a carbon price there sometime soon. That would be so much more important. But thank you all, and thank you again. That was really nice. Thank you. This is great. I just wonder, with 4 little grandchildren running around the house.
Not everybody has an obelisk, right?
Thank you again for joining us tonight. I'm Tom Holmes, Chair of the Department of Economics. It has been a true pleasure to gather in person and online to celebrate one of our most outstanding alumni. Bob? Where did Bob? Yeah. We are proud to count you among our Minnesota economics family. I know you have inspired us all with this story, and wow. For those of you on Zoom, thank you for joining us, and have a good night. For those of you in person, well, there's a perk to coming in person, because there's going to be a reception right out those doors, and so please stick around and congratulate Bob in person. So let's give him one more hand.